One important concept in WordPress is the ability to separate your design from your content. And in our last video, we talked about templates. And then our goal in this tutorial is to take a static single post template that was created in our previous episode and make some parts dynamic so that a content writer can write content in their favorite editor, which I believe is the block editor. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which editor do you prefer? You can combine it with some meta fields using something like MetaBox, ACF, Jet Engine, ACPT, and so on. In this example, we're using MetaBox. And then on the front end, all the user is going to see is the nice design, which is a combination of the design we created and the content from the content writer. So now let's go ahead and see how we can create this design. So first, like I mentioned, I created some meta fields using MetaBox. So these are the custom fields. We may need to remember the names so that we can call it properly in the builder. And then we can go over to our templates, which is under Builderius and then templates. I created a single post template, which is what we'll be editing today. Let's go ahead and open in Builderius. So at the moment, all of the information is static. Now let's go ahead and make it dynamic. As I mentioned in the beginning, Builderius uses data variables to store our dynamic data. Those data variables are objects that have our dynamic content embedded in them. And by default, Builderius has one called the WP data variable, and that stores all of our dynamic data related to the current page or the current template. So like our post title, any meta field that is related to the current post is stored in the WP data variable. And that's what we'll be using mostly in this video. After that, I'll show you how you can create your own data variables, and you can use those to manipulate data in any shape or form you want. For example, you want to retrieve data from a related post or from an external source, like an external JSON source. You can do all of that using the dynamic data builder. So let's continue. To get the post title, all you have to do is click on the dynamic data tag, and then we'll just search for what we want. In this case, we're looking for the title. Then we can go ahead and check under post, the title. So we have our post title. One nice thing about Builderius is that you can have both dynamic tags and static text within the same content area. But in this case, we just need the dynamic tag, so I can delete the static text. So we have the first one, which is the post title, and that's the same thing we do for the rest. So for example, the author, this is from MetaBox and it's called book author. So I deleted the static text. I'll click on the dynamic tag and then I'll search for the book author. You can see it's coming from MetaBox. And like I mentioned, it starts with WP dot, because WP is the object that is for the current post template. And then we're just accessing that object. So we're accessing the post within the object and then the meta field and so on within the object. When we are creating our own dynamic data tag, then you understand how all of this notation works. So basically this is WP dot means you are trying to access the array or the object. So we have the author now retrieved. We can do the same thing for the featured image. So I'll click on the image. I'll replace the static content with some dynamic tags. So I'll click on the dynamic tag and search for featured. And you can see we have the featured image, alt text, featured image caption. But what we need is the URL. So I'll click on URL. And I want maybe the medium large. And we get our URL. Then we may also want the alt text. So the same way, so under alt text, dynamic tag, and I'll search for featured alt text. And we get that, and so on. But one thing you must remember is that for the WP variable, you have to use the dynamic data tag. You can't just write it on your own because Builderius is creating it on the fly to make it more optimized. So these variables are not loaded on your page automatically. When you use the drop-down icon and you click on it, then the variable is actually created on the backend. All we see first is the title, but when you click on it is when it is now generated on the backend for more efficiency. So we have our featured image. Then let's go to something more complex like the release date. So for the release date, I'll go ahead and delete the static text, click on the data tag and search for release date, which is a meta box field. But by default, my meta box is set to return the value as YMD, which is year-month-day, but I want to return it in the British format, which is day, the month, and then the year. So there is a nice way we can do that. I'll leave a link to the Builderius documentation. We need to use a function to manipulate our data. The functions are part of the Builderius expression language. So what we'll do is we start with date, open the bracket, and I'll close the dates bracket. So that is within the square brackets. I'll now start with my function, which is the date function. It is basically using the WP dates function. So if you know that, you can know this one. The first argument in the function is whatever format you want to return. So in this example, I want to return the J space capital F space capital Y. And then after the quotation marks, I'll put the comma. And you can see the output is now 28 September 2025. If you want it to any other format, you just choose the format you want. So that's how you can format a date field. So we can continue with maybe the quote. And I'll go ahead and search for my quote. So we get our quote. So let's say for whatever reason, you also want to trim the words. Let's say you want it to only return the first 10 words or something like that. Builderius has some other handy functions which you can retrieve by just clicking on the right click and you see transform. So transform is basically all of those functions, like I mentioned, the dates function and some other functions. So if you use the transform, it shows you a list of some functions. I believe in the future, they will expand the list to include like the one I just showed previously with the dates. But let's say you want to get the trim words, something like you want to limit maybe by words, and then you just write how many words you want to limit it by. So let's say I want only 10 words and the ... So you can go ahead and apply. And you can see it starts with the function name, which is limit_words, then open the bracket and then put in your arguments. And you can see it took the first 10 words and then it put ... for us. So that's how easy it is. Then let's say we want to now get the post content. So I'll go ahead and click on the content area. Right now is static text. I can go ahead and delete the static text and I'll get my post content. So let's go ahead and look for content. And unfortunately for this current example, there is no content. So let me go ahead and save. And we can quickly switch our preview to something else by going to the top right-hand side. You can see the current preview, which is book reviews, child of the digital age. Let's say I want to switch it to something else like dancing with shadows. So it now switches my whole preview to that dancing with shadows, which contains a post content. But what you'll notice is that the content is not formatted properly. It is returning my HTML tags as strings rather than outputting it as actual HTML elements. So to make it output as an actual HTML element, we need to unescape it, because by default, every dynamic data within Builderius is escaped for security reasons. So to unescape the content, you simply go back to your content area and you convert it from the 2 square brackets to 3 square brackets. So if I right click, you can see unescape. So that's an easy way to do it, or you can manually put it to 3 square brackets, but this is an easier way. And now you see the content is being outputted properly. And that's how you can get all of your dynamic data for your single post template into the current page. So let's go ahead and save and preview on the front end. And you see our data is correct. I can go back to the book reviews and choose another review. So maybe code red. And we get all of our content using that same template. The next dynamic data example we'll take a look at is using query loops, which in Builderius are called collections. So here we have a post type archive template for my book reviews archive, and basically want to convert the static loop into a dynamic loop. So first we need a collection element. So I can go ahead and click on the elements plus and search for collection. And then I'll make that collection to go before my UL. Within that collection element, I'm just going to drop in one of the templates for one of the cards, which is going to be from the LI. And I can delete the other UL. So now we have the collection. A collection element is basically an element we use whenever we want to create a loop. So any kind of loop. It doesn't have to be a WordPress post loop. It can be anything. It can be static data. It can be an external source, maybe an API from Airtable or somewhere else. So any dynamic data source, as long as it is something that can be repeated, then you can use the collection element for that. So I'll start by clicking on the collection element. I'll change the tag to UL. Then the data source, similar to how you use dynamic data tags, you use the same source of a dynamic data and you get some options. So the first option is breadcrumb, which is what I created myself. So you won't see it on your own example. But then we have the one we need for the archive, which is the post query posts. Then we also have nav menu, which is stored in WP, which means it is native. And that's what I use to create my navigation menu for my primary navigation. But we're looking for the post query. So I'll just click on post query posts. And that's how simple it is. As you can see, now we are returning data. So all we have to do now is replace our static data with dynamic data. So first, let me just give the UL a class name so that it is formatted properly. So we have our list of posts coming in, but like I said, they're using static data. So we just replace those data now. So I'll start with the post title. I'll go to my content, replace the post title with the dynamic data tag. Whenever you create a loop, then there is an extra option that comes up called the loop option. You can also switch directly to it from the select field. Right now the select is showing all. If I click on the select field, I can now make it more specific to be only for the loop. And these are the elements that I get for the loop specifically. So the first one I want is the title. It's my post title. And I'm now retrieving my post title. The next is the excerpt. So I'll go over to the paragraph, delete the static data and search for excerpt. So that's my post excerpt. And we get our post excerpt. Like I mentioned in the previous example, I can right click and do transform and then say limit words. But let me not do that now. So I'll just go to the image, remove the static text, and then put in my dynamic tag for my featured image. So featured. Make sure you are in the loop. And then I'll look for the medium or maybe medium large. So we have that completed. If you want to get your pagination, you just drop in an element. So let's say I'll drop in a div. Make that the last element of the page somewhere. And I'll check under the dynamic data tag and just search for, I believe it's pagination. We get the WordPress pagination. At the moment it's escaped. So I'll right click and say unescaped. And we get our default WordPress pagination. You might do some styling and other things, but that is basically it. I can go ahead and save. And we have our archive page. So let me go ahead and preview it. And you see, we get our archive. for our book reviews. And yeah, that's how easy it is to display a list of posts using the collection element. So now we'll take it a step further and see how we can do some more complex dynamic data stuff. Let's take a look. For the first example, let's say we are in our footer component and want to set up our copyright so that it always shows the current year. By default, the dynamic data from Builderius doesn't have anything for current year, but that's where we can now use our own function. So to create your own function, as a pro user, you have a tab at the bottom of your screen called Dynamic Data. If you click on that, it opens up a window which is divided into 4 columns. The first column is where you decide, do you want your dynamic data variable to be a global variable or a template level variable? The global variable means it will run on every page and every template, while the template level variable means it will only run on the current template. Then the next column is where you create the variable name. By default, we have the WP variable name that comes with every template, but this is where you now define your own custom variable name. The next column is the editor, where you now add in the nested objects, but those nested objects will be saved to the variable. And Builderius has a nice handy list of snippets that we can use currently until they now finally bring out the UI. You can take advantage of the snippet library. And that just gives you a list of predefined snippets that you can use. Like if you want to query related posts, so if I search for related, you can see related posts by author, related posts by taxonomy, and so on. Then you can see the preview on the right-hand column. So that's how it is set up. So now let's go ahead and create our own variable to get the current date. So I'll click on variable plus, and I'll create one called date, save and edit. So now it opens a new tab called the date. And within that tab is where we get the nested object. You have to put all of your information within that curly bracket. So now let's go ahead and see if there's any snippet for date. At the moment, there are none, but hopefully in the future, they will add some snippets that can just make the process easy. So since there were no snippets for date, we'll have to create our own date. And one nice thing about Builderius is that it has autocomplete. So at the moment, I can just press Ctrl or Command I, and we can get access to the autocomplete screen. And you can see all of the different things you can do within the object. So you can get things that are related to ACF, you can get things related to archive, and so on. So you can get from your normal WordPress things like the post queries. So if I search for post, you can see post query. You can get for terms query. You can get for user and user query. So user means you want to get from the current user. User query means you want to basically create a query loop. So different options are there. But in this example, we're trying to use a PHP function that will return the date. So all I'll do is search for PHP. So PHP function output. And then I'll give it what is the function name. In this example, it will be date. Then I'll put a comma. And then I'll put the Ctrl I again and see what are the other things I can put within this function name. So I need to get arguments. And the argument I need here is simply the format of the timestamp. So I'll say I want the format to be, make sure it's in the double quotation marks. And the format, let's say I want it to be y-m-d. Let's now go ahead and get data. And you can see PHP function output is 2025 and then the date. I can change the format to whatever I want. You can simply get this date function by searching in Google, or you can make use of the AI training tool. So you can follow their steps. I'll leave a link to the documentation from Builderius where you can use AI. So basically AI will be able to understand the function that you need and give you the right function that you need. So let's say I want it to rather just be year. So that's just Y. get data, and I get my date. Then let's go ahead and see how we can get the output. So I'll close the dynamic data. I'll now replace my 2025 with my dynamic data. So I'll click on the dynamic data tag, because once you've created a dynamic data, it will now be registered in Builderius, and you can now use the regular drop down to search for it. I'll search for my date. Let me go ahead and choose that date. You can see our date is returned, but you will see that the name is not very nice. It's called PHP function output. What we can do to make the name pretty is create an alias. So I'll go back to my dynamic data tag, to my date, and just before the name of the function, you simply give it an alias, which is basically like a key for your key value pair. So the alias will now be maybe current underscore year. Then I'll put a colon. So now if you do get data, you see that now it says current underscore year is 2025. So basically, it's just like you are creating a key value pair. The value is your function. The key is your alias. And we can now use this alias within our page. So if I close the window, I can now go ahead and delete the initial function I created. And then I'll use the dynamic data tag again and search for date. And now you see the name is prettier. It's now called current year. And it gives me my current year. So I can go ahead and save. Yeah, that's it. We can also perform some functions. Like I mentioned, I will leave a link to the documentation. You can perform different kinds of functions in the dynamic data tag, directly in the content area, or within the Builderius dynamic data editor. So either one will work. So let's say I want to now add, let's say, a number to the 2025. I can simply come into this date and say I want to convert this date into an integer. So I'll say int val and then +1. And you see it changes to 2026, because by default, any return value from the dynamic data tag is a string. So first I converted it to a number, then I did a +1 to make it 2026. And you can do different kind of functions. If you want to do that same kind of thing within the Builderius editor, you can do it as well. And what I'll be doing is we use what we call transform right here as well. So I'll write at transform and then expression, which is going to be the name of the variable, which is current year. So I'll do the same thing. I'll write int val current underscore year and then +1 return, and you see 2026. So the same thing you do here, this transform here is the same transform I did in the editor. So either one will do the same thing. And now you see it's now saying 2027 because I did +1 in the data and then +1 in the builder. So that's how you can do some funky functions. So two functions you need to remember are the PHP function output and expressions. The full name is called expression result. So expression result is the same thing as the transform, but the transform just basically takes on the current value and then modifies it. With the expression result, you are creating a new variable. That's just the difference. Hopefully, I'll be doing a live stream this Thursday to do a more in-depth deep dive into dynamic data in Builderius. So check it out. If it's in the future, I'll leave a link to the live stream in the comments. So yeah, that's just a basic overview. You can also use shortcodes in Builderius. Just literally put a single square bracket and then put your shortcode inside. It will not show up in the builder, but it will show up on the front end. They are working on a full-on shortcode element, which will be in the builder soon. But for now, there are two ways. You can either use the dynamic data to create a do shortcode function, and that will run the shortcode in the builder, or you can just write the shortcode directly into any content area and it will render on the front end, but not in the builder. So things like your Jet form builder, your Fluent forms, and any other kind of form plugin that requires shortcodes, you can use that in the builder. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.